welcome, Jim and Roger. Thank you for agreeing to participate in our conversation this morning. As we discussed, today's topic is on governing. And I thought I would just start off the conversation and let you both take it where it goes with an interesting question that occurred to me yesterday as I was preparing, and that is maybe from your at a more basic sense of what is the purpose of a government? Why are they created? What role do they play in society? And we can take it from there.
Why don't we let Roger start off, because he spent his whole life on this very question.
I was going to say that we ought to let Jim, as the older and the wiser, but I think that itself is a fundamental question that is explored in the greatest of the political philosophers. And in general, I think you can kind of divide into two groups. For the ancients, the end of government was the good life, and so the theme, the basic political theme of say Plato and Aristotle, is the nature of the best regime, the one that allows the most people to achieve the good life. And of course, there's all kinds of questions about what the good life is, and then what kind of regime it would be. Questions that Jim and I have explored at least 2 or 3 times in different seminars that we've taught, and sometimes quite intensively, as what I hope we could talk about. Now, in modern political thought, I think and what I said about ancients, I think also applies to the medievals, of course, with the rise of the change, with the rise of the revealed religions. In modern political philosophy, I think the general idea is that was aiming at too much in the name of trying to achieve the best society. There'd been basically a failure even to achieve, in most cases, basic foundational arrangements for political society. So I think that the general answer to the question in modern political thought is the end of political society is freedom. And you find that in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator's inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice it's the pursuit of happiness that is what's seen as a right, not the attainment of happiness. So the essence of the matter there is what I would call limited government, limited in its purposes, not necessarily in its means or its institutions, but in the best case, limited in that way as well.
So same question to you.
Yeah, so I think it's a matter of great debate that needs to be shown to the students. Yeah, go ahead, Jim. I'm sorry.
Well, I agree entirely with what Roger has said. I would simply refine it a little bit, because I think it's right that the aim of government is for the citizens to have the good life, and with Aristotle and Plato, I would say that the good life is a life of virtuous activity, and that the modern aim is also the good life, but modern people in general don't understand that the good life is a life of virtuous activity. They think it's a life of one of the false goods of antiquity, of material luxury and length and things like that. But I think that the ancients, when they discussed freedom, they meant the freedom of the soul. That's a view that's both Stoic and Platonic. And by freedom, they meant free from irrationality, and free from vice, and free from bad habits, and free from the enslaving bad habits of being mean or glory mongering or money grubbing. So it's if if freedom from those vices is what's meant by freedom, that would be the same goal as the goal of antiquity. So that's the only refinement I would make on that.
Well, it's the same goal if you,
Number, as it's used by utilitarians, never refers to the greater virtue. You know?
no, that's true. But it's only the same if you slide over the difference between ancient and modern liberty. You're absolutely right about ancient liberty, that it's freedom from the corruption and vice and so on. But excuse me, the modern freedom, on the other hand, is freedom to, in a certain sense, follow. For many people, is following, as you indicated. Can you?
It's not coming from my house.
It's coming from my house. Yeah,
Oh,
I'm sorry.
It'll pass, no worries.
Anyway, that is the freedom to follow those inclinations. See.
Pause for a second. Don't worry, Roger. We'll just pause.
well,
Yeah,
I'm going to hope that it's somebody at your house using a credit card, and then we can have that number.
No. It's a stupid announcement.
Let me know when it's over, Roger. I have a follow-up question.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Roger,
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, that's it. Yeah, I thought we were going to discuss our experiences together in teaching, but actually, this question raises, I think, a very interesting one. You remember, Jim, the first time we taught together?
Of course.
I think
that was
the
the year
topic.
that Alvarenga was a freshman, but he hadn't yet been picked as a merit scholar. He went on to win the Jones Phi Beta Kappa Prize with that class, so he was certainly worthy.
Yeah, you remember? I think our topic was something like good man and good citizen, or something like that, and you led off with Aristotle's Ethics of the first book, and I think there was about, well, I know at least 2 or 3 weeks of debate over the question whether there is a human good or not. Do you remember that?
Yes, and whether it's the same for all human beings,
Yeah.
or whether it's just what anybody thinks. Yes.
And it was an
Take
intense
the
discussion,
relativism
too.
out of them. It was a great success.
Who were the, well, yeah, who were the guys that were the most vociferous? I was trying to remember if
Well, there was
Lane-
Bradley Wallet, and he started off like Thrasymachus, or Thrasymachus, but he ended up really quite tame. And I ran into him once at the homecoming,
Yeah.
and he saw me and rushed up, and he said that course changed his the direction. It made him a much better person, really, because he was persuaded by Aristotle's theory of happiness, though it took a while. No.
It took a lot. It was like beating a hot iron on an anvil.
But it yielded. It yielded. He
Um,
was teachable,
And Lane was in that. Joe Lane was in
Yes.
that too, right?
but he was less noisy. And Will Hyde was there, and Gwaltney, and it was a good class.
It was. It was a very good class. But
And
it re-
McVeigh, who does the who fights the slavery, he was in that, the human trafficking. He was in that class too.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, it was a good illustration of the kind of problem we've been talking about. What is the good? And it was great.
Roger, let me go back to if I made it the first question. This one of the interesting issues here in governing, right, is the collective versus individual good. As you think about the fundamental nature of a good government,
Hmm.
how do you begin to think about what does it owe to the whole, and what does it owe to the individual?
Well, I maybe I'll start on this one. Um, um, I think that if we look at Athens and Sparta, they reflect different answers to the question. In Athens, at least the democratic ideal of Athens was that the state should give people as much freedom as they possibly could have in order that they could achieve in happiness as individuals. And the focus in Athens was on the individual. And we think of Athens really primarily through great individuals, or at least notorious individuals, but they're individuals. But when it came to Sparta, the idea was that a Spartan should fight for Sparta, but he should do so anonymously. He could die in battle, and his death was worthwhile because it was a death for the glory of Sparta. And the Spartan regimental unit was conceived of as a unit, and it was part of a kind of superorganism of Sparta, and everything there counted for the good of Sparta. And that was the big view there. Now that was also the view of some of the Athenian philosophers, and principally Socrates. When he chooses to die and not escape from Athens after he's convicted of corrupting the youth, he's putting the good of the laws and of his society before a long life for himself. And he was dying, in a sense, for the laws of Athens. And that was, in some ways, a Spartan view. And it would contrast with Alcibiades, who, when he was even pursued by the Athenians to come back for trial, he fled and he went to Sparta, and he seduced the wife of the king of Sparta, and then he came back to Athens and was loved and hated, and he was always looking out for himself, not for the good of Athens. So that's what I would say about that.
I think this is a good example of how the study of the classics can illuminate things that are really eternal or perpetual, as long as they're human beings. In a way, it seems to me that Sparta and Athens represent, as Jim was saying, two radically different views about the good, and as it relates to individuals and society. Sparta, it's like one great organism, and it was made to be that way by the laws. Athens, maximum of individual liberty. What they illustrate is, though, maybe how there's no easy answer to that question, and B, there's danger, either problems, I say, at least, either way you go. It's hard with looking at the regime of Sparta to think, boy, I'd really like to be a part of that. It's it wasn't just right. that the Spartans weren't allowed to be, in a way, individuals. They were to be made into sort of worker bees in the hive. It's that in many ways, what was demanded was counter against nature, against natural inclinations that are very important and very powerful.
Even the family life was unnatural for human beings. You raised the children in common, and people didn't know who their fathers were.
Or at least according to what was said about them, share your wife.
Yes.
So, that kind of thing is hard to swallow. But on the other side, of course, you had the great individuals of Athens, but you also had the constant internal faction and competitiveness and so on. And all this, of course, comes out really nicely in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, where he really does, I think, show the war as the confrontation of two different kinds of societies, or almost even civilizations, that both had their strengths, but also both had their weaknesses. And one way he does it is, I think, is to show how there really weren't any extraordinary individuals among the Spartans. The only Spartan that really stands out in Thucydides is Brasidas. He's like the Athenian among the Spartans. And then, yeah.
But and Thucydides also shows the terrible vices of the Athenians as a fighting force.
Oh, absolutely.
Over again, he shows that they're undisciplined. They can't work together more than a few hours or a few days. And that's shown by the incident at Pylos, and more acutely during the Syracusan the invasion, the Sicilian expedition,
Oh, yeah.
where the Nicias writes back to Athens and saying, "I can't control these Athenians. They won't work together," and that's the problem of democracy. Everybody's sovereign.
Well,
Staying on this topic, it reminds me of a debate I followed this year. If you want to say there's a modern parallel to this, which has been the COVID situation, and how a society in China, which aims for the collective good of the society, dealt with the issue. Maybe say a kind of Spartan model, and then how the U.S. maybe Athenian model dealt with it. And there have been more than one point of view that says, well, here's a collective approach, and look how well it was handled. And then you have this individualistic approach, and you see what happened there. Would you put some validity in that point of view, or do you think it's such a completely different situation?
Well, I think that it was a good thing for you to bring up, and it shows just what Roger was pointing out, the defects of both kinds of regime. I will tell you that the ancient political philosophers were united in the view that democracy was a terrible form of government. It was really pretty much unthinkable. No serious political theorist in antiquity, anyway, and I hope Roger will come in on this subject. They all thought that a monarchy ruled by a really wise person was the best form of government. Then came an aristocracy, which was a rule by the best. Then came a democracy, which was a rule by many, but they were all honorable people. Then came a democracy, and then came an oligarchy, which was a kind of military junta ruling. And then came the worst, which was the opposite of the king, because the corruption of the best, as Aristotle says, is the worst, was a tyranny where everybody works for the good of the tyrant. But I think the ancients also were the first to come up with the idea of a mixed constitution, which combined the various pure forms, and this was also a contrasting view in antiquity, whether a population should be uniform and homogeneous or whether they should be heterogeneous. The Romans, who admitted immigrants and gave them full citizenship, believed in heterogeneity. The Athenians and the Spartans both, said you needed to have either Spartan or Athenian parents on both sides, and this led to a real disintegration of those societies when they could only marry the pure folk. But if China is looked at as a pure kind of tyranny and America as a pure democracy, it shows really the weaknesses there. The weaknesses, even in our mixed constitution, have come to the fore from time to time.
I was going to say this. Jim's absolutely right. None of the classics would say democracy was a good thing. In fact, I think in the history of political philosophy, the first guy ever to give an argument for democracy as a good thing was Spinoza, and and even his kind of democracy is not exactly what we would think. Very close to Hobbes's absolute monarchy. And yet there is one good thing about democracy, at least that Plato hints at. In Book 8 of the Republic, where Socrates evolves the various regimes, beginning with the best regime, which is a kind of aristocracy, the rule of the philosopher kings, and then down through timocracy to oligarchy, finally to democracy, and then to tyranny. It's only in the context of his discussion of democracy that he uses the word philosophy. Which, if you think about it, is probably a real point that he's making. Socrates would have never been able to be a philosopher in Sparta. If he had been born in Sparta, he would have been all of his individuality, all of his questioning, everything would be beaten out of him. So the issue, there is something good about democracy. But democracy itself, if it's left to its own wild instincts, is self-destructive. That leads, as Jim was talking about, to idea of a mixed regime, which you find very well in very forcefully put in Aristotle's Politics, but it's also really the point of Plato's Laws, the longest of his dialogues. And what I think you see as the classical teaching is something that Jim and I think at least came out in the last thing that Jim and I have taught together, and that was this seminar this past term on leadership in Cicero and Plato's Gorgias. And in the Gorgias, at least what I saw, was a peculiar way that Socrates replaces wisdom with moderation as the highest of the virtues. And from a political point of view, I think the point is that is maybe the highest virtue, moderation. And the problem of any kind of regime is that it tends to become more like itself, if you will, more radical democracy, more radical oligarchy, whatever. And so the goal is, or the best practicable approach is to moderate those and curb those influences. And speaking on behalf of our own society, our own regime in this context, I think that's a lot of what the framers were after with the institutions of a modern republic that allow for the people to govern, but only through institutions and culminating in the rule of law. That, I think, is a pretty good example of what Plato and Aristotle had in mind with the best of the mixed regime.
As Roger was talking, I had a few ideas that I would like to contribute. I think that what he said about the founding fathers reminded me of the founders of Hampden-Sydney, who on the eve of the Revolutionary War decided not to form regiments or militias, but they decided they were going to establish a liberal arts college. And the liberal arts that they had in mind were reading the classics with their view of government and a good human being as citizen. And I think that liberal education, as at least it used to be, even when you were here, we still had a liberal arts curriculum. It's in decline now, but what Roger said about democracy giving rise and allowing for philosophy, I thought was a very good point. And we might, Plato said that justice would only be achieved when philosophers became kings, but it might be also fair to say that a democracy will work when philosophers become the citizens in the democracy and people who are infused with higher virtues. And that was, I think, the goal of establishing liberal education as a kind of education for America. Remember, liberal education was never going to be for the masses. The voters in our country were those who had a stake in the country, and they were educated and that they had these ideals. And that's what I meant, that it's liberally educated people who would make the best citizens in a democracy like ours. But liberal education has not been a success in the United States. It's in complete decline now, and there even the schools that call themselves liberal arts schools. Our former president Howard at Hampden-Sydney defined liberal arts as small classes, and that for him was the essence of the liberal arts education. It was the education where the classes were small. But I think that Roger and I would agree that a liberal arts education really depends on a liberal arts curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Roger, I want to go back to something you said, which I found very interesting, and that was the virtue of moderation in a leader. Because I think for a lot of people, we don't think of leaders that way, right? We think of the leader as not the moderate person, the person who has this bold vision that won't take no for an answer. You think about, especially in business, an Elon Musk or a Steve Jobs, famous for lots of things except being moderate.
Mm-hmm.
anyway. So what do you see that it may be a political leader, moderation is the highest virtue, but maybe not in other areas? Or you think that's just the characteristic of a leader's moderation?
Yeah, not in other areas. Well, I guess there always has to be some curbing of enthusiasm, but you're right. Within the arena of business, maybe an industry, maybe radicalism is worthwhile. Of course, if it doesn't work out, it only affects one or a few people.
Mhm.
But if it doesn't work out if immoderate leadership doesn't work out in a society, who suffers? Well, everybody does. I've come to believe one of the greatest experiences I've had as a teacher, frankly, Carlos, is studying Greek with Jim here, and then together translating the Gorgias, right? And for a long time, it's been a mystery to me why in the Gorgias you have this peculiar situation that there are a number of references to the Peloponnesian War, but chronologically they're scattered out over the whole course of the war, as if this conversation started when Pericles was still in power and ends up with Alcibiades leading or at least convincing the Athenians to make the big attempt at Sicily. And so why? And I believe that there's a fundamental and a very profound point there. The immoderation of the Athenian leadership, or their unwillingness, let's say, to curb the enthusiasms of the Athenian demos, is what all along led to not only the coming of the war, but to the destruction of Athens in the war. What is, in a sense, proven on the surface of the Gorgias about the role of moderation, in the discussion, especially between Socrates and Callicles, is demonstrated on a practical level in what stands behind and sort of in the shadows of the Gorgias, which is the disasters for Athens of getting into the Peloponnesian War and then losing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sorry.
I wanted to add something to what you were saying. I think that the idea of moderation we find also in Thucydides, but not exactly the same way as it's in Plato. Thucydides, in his eulogy of Pericles, says that what made Pericles such a good leader is that he was financially incorruptible. He was honest. He always told the truth to the Athenian people. And this gave him a real kind of authority, a moral authority, so that even though he was elected, he was still a kind of monarch because he was the best man. And when he died in the plague, then the people who came after him, as Thucydides says, lacked all self-control. And
Yeah.
the person he hates is Cleon, who's a warmonger and has no kind of self-restraint whatsoever. He's just a terrible person. And so I think that's right. But self-restraint is not one of the American ideals.
No.
It's not what our founding fathers could have thought. The idea of classical virtues is become courage in America. That's the big virtue, and anybody who exhibits courage becomes a hero, and justice and wisdom and self-restraint go out the window. Though we like people with self-restraint like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, who are not greedy and are self-restrained and also just and wise, but their self-restraint is one of their qualities.
Yeah. I'd like to make that a point on the level of presidential rhetoric. Okay, that's a theme that we've had on our minds in this recent semester. If you look at the history of presidential rhetoric, let's say the way that people would attempt to become elected president, down to Theodore Roosevelt or probably or possibly Woodrow Wilson, absolutely, this was the idea. that one could not go out and campaign for the presidency, that was not appropriate, you would, there would be a, say a manifesto or we call it a platform from the one's party, and then it would be up to the followers, the assistants, whatever of the candidate to go out and do the campaigning. But the candidate himself was expected not to do that kind of thing, because it would be the role of a demagogue to do that. And it wasn't until certainly Wilson that idea changed. Now, once the presidential candidates got involved in what we now call campaigning, and just assume that that's supposed to be part of what they do, what do we have? Candidates competing with each other to, in a sense, outpromise all the great things they're going to do. And of course, it's all a fraud, or virtually almost all a fraud. You could take every platform of every candidate going back for decades and look at the things they said they're going to do, look what they actually did, and find out there's very little overlap. And the reason is, of course, we have this system of divided, checked and balanced power. Congress has something to say, the courts have something to say. And yet we Americans have become inured to that kind of behavior. We expect our candidates to tell us all the great things they're going to do to make sure that everybody has a job and everybody has all the good things that everybody else has, and so on. That we can all kind of be like the kids in Lake Wobegon. We're all above average, you know, and it's all a sham. Well, when I teach American political thought, I try to point this out, that American political rhetoric in a lot of ways has been debased by this kind of campaigning and promising and over-promising. And one last point on this also gets back to the good of classical liberal education. That maybe there's a correspondence between the time when people took liberal education seriously as a way of preparing for leadership, and that meant to a great extent studying the Greek and Roman or Latin classics, that they did understand the need for moderation and the danger of demagoguery. Nowadays, we've forgotten about liberal education, and everything is now, in a sense, in the light of the promise of science. We're always looking for the experts who can make things better quickly. See? Of course, the experts with their science can never change human nature, and that's where things fall apart. Yeah.
It's not just the scientists that are looked to, but it's the economists.
Oh yeah. Well, they claim to be scientists of the economy, right, Jim?
How we can have endless growth, and endless growth. We've now had 2 college presidents in a row who were economists or had MBAs or business degrees. And the problem with modern business is that it's so unphilosophical. And what I mean by that is they don't have the kind of Stoic philosophy, it was the same in this particular matter as the Epicurean philosophy, being happy with what you've got and cultivating your garden and trying to make your limited polis, which could only be a certain size, as wonderful as it could be, to make it in a garden, an oasis, a paradise, a kind of paradise. Instead, it's the idea of endless growth. And we see that endless growth, when things get too big, they fall apart. Even the great industries of the past, like Western Union or the railroads, they got big, and then those bubbles burst. So I think that if we could somehow infuse philosophy into our industrialists and our politicians, they would be better. You were here when Malcolm Forbes came to the
Oh, yeah.
college,
Oh, absolutely.
and he gave the graduation speech.
Best graduation speech I think we've ever had.
Well, it was certainly one of the best, though I will say that the Vice President Bush, when he came,
Uh,
he also gave a good speech. It was all devoted to Xenophon's Anabasis.
yeah, that's right.
And that was also a very good speech. But Malcolm Forbes, talked about the virtues of a liberal education, how it was hard to get your first job, but then your rise was meteoric. I think this was also true of Carlos here, that he had meteoric rises in
My son
looking for a place.
my son has had that experience. He's gone into um, computer science or computer development, for, software writing, and so on. And when he was hired at it's a basically defense and federal government contracting institution. He was hired along with people who had computer science degrees from Virginia Tech and other places like that. Spent most of their undergraduate careers doing that kind of stuff. But pretty soon it turned out he, with his Hampden-Sydney liberal arts, liberal education, he was the guy that the bosses tended to turn to get things done and get it done right. He could write. Pardon?
I'll challenge this as somebody who's held up sometimes as an example of how this works. There's a little bit of selection bias. I think I've worked with my boss who was a classics major at Oxford, and his boss was a classics major at Oxford, and Ted Turner was a classics major. But all it says is that people who are very smart tend to pick classics, and so they would have done well whatever they had picked. We don't ever talk about the classics majors who never couldn't get a job or failed out of business school or had a horrendous post classics sort of professional life.
I think it is too bad.
Sometimes we handpick the ones and make it seem like that's all you need, right?
Well, it's not all. I think it's too bad that we don't proudly say we are going to have a classical liberal education. I prefer liberal education to liberal arts. Okay, I'm not sure the arts, but liberal, and proudly say this involves a lot of the study of the Greeks and the Latins, but not only. And couldn't we at least dedicate the first couple of years to that kind of thing, and then allow people to go out? I think it would infuse both worthwhile knowledge, but also certain kinds of virtues that would do well wherever our guys were to go on.
Roger, I want to go back to something you said, because I had a chance to chat with Katty Kay one time, the BBC correspondent who covers the US, and she had an interesting kind of perspective. She said, if I asked her, what do you think about what's happening in the 2016 election? She said, the thing that I see is America is an engine that was built to run on moderation. That was his exact word. And you're running out of fuel. When it runs out of fuel, the engine will just stop. And I wonder if you think there's any connection in what we've talked about, decline of liberal arts or liberal education, lack of interest in classical thought, and the decline in moderation as a nation.
I think there absolutely is. And I would only say that it's not just something of the last 4 years. If you go back 8 years, they haven't seen a whole lot of the spirit of moderation. Mostly it's the spirit of the new frontier. Here's what we're going to do. Remember Obama saying now we can really change America, and now Trump responds with "Take America Back." I think it again has to do with the sort of simplistic sense that science, if we just turn the scientists loose, and we, I teach in the social sciences, right? Everything is scientific that has any value, supposedly. We just turn the scientists loose, they can solve all of our problems. So we don't need to be to restrain ourselves in the light of what are really permanent human circumstances. And I think maybe real study in the classics would help in that, to show that we're not any different from the ancients as human beings. We're confronted with certain fundamental realities that we ought to recognize as never going away.
I would say that the fuel that is missing, or that we're running out of, is a sense of civic responsibility. And I don't know that people have to study classics in order to do that, but there was a kind of pseudo classics or quasi classics that used to be part of our education, at least when I went to school, and I think when Roger did too, even though he, as he pointed out earlier, is much younger. And that was that we had to take civics. It was a required course in either grade school or high school. And we learned about the American government and the founding fathers. And we spent a long time on it. It was at my elementary school, it was in the 8th grade, and it was a whole year course. Part of it was devoted to New York State and part of it to the US government. But it filled us with a kind of patriotism and love of our country. And because the founding fathers were themselves infused with the classics, it was this interest in civic virtue infected everybody. But I think that civics is no longer taught. Our students come to Hampden-Sydney and they don't know, how the Constitution is. The word checks and balances they think has to do with their checking account. I mean, they just don't understand very much. And with the elimination of Western culture and any kinds of cultural readings, it's even less. So I thought that if a democracy works best where you have an educated population who votes, then we're losing that, and the fuel is what your friend told you, Carlos, is right. The fuel is coming to its end. But it is renewable. It's not like oil or something like that. It is a renewable fuel.
Resource. Let's hope so.
What's become over the years maybe my favorite class to teach is American political thought. And by really taking seriously the thought of Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, Lincoln, Clay, and then moving through the history of American political thought, it's possible to, I think, teach some of those lessons. Not only what the government that we have, the regime that we have, is intended to do, but how it goes about doing it, and what's good about it. What are the good things that come from this? What's happened though is, and this is really troubling to me, is the rise of critical theory in all of its forms. And all critical theory is just gripe about this, gripe about that, and where now the spirit of higher education tends to be just tear it down. I'm really troubled by that. The 1619 project that the New York Times cobbled together, which creates propounds a fraud that the United States was founded in 1619, not 1776. That's immensely destructive. Yeah, something needs to be done to try to reverse that. But I don't know where the strength is going to come to do it, because what they're getting in the graduate schools is that.
Mm-hmm.
I would identify a different problem and lack of leadership in modern higher education. And I'm saying things that are well known, that the United States started off with liberal arts colleges, but in general, the education started off with with people having to memorize things. And then the German model was followed with big lectures. And now at most universities, the classes might have 200, 300, 400, 500 people in gigantic auditoriums, and they require just sitting passively on the part of the students, and those are advantages for the professors because they can just prepare their lectures, and they don't have to think after, and they can give the same lecture year after year, and they can concentrate on publications. And that's where all the rewards are in education. Even liberal arts colleges have turned into mini universities where people think about publishing on and this is an analog to what Roger is saying. It's easier to write a paper on literary theory or something like that than it is actually to read those works with insight. And I think that kind of thing has ruined higher education, so that people go to school, and a college, a university will boast that it has a couple of Nobel Prize winners, but the students never see them.
You never see it.
Um, and the teaching isn't cared about anymore, or not as much as it would. People will be denied tenure if they're fantastic teachers, but if they haven't a long enough publication list.
A couple of points about what Jim's saying there. The absence of you might say civic or moral education, I think, is now infected even the natural sciences. I've read a number of articles recently about the problem of repeatability, or that people have published scientific papers in learned journals. Other people have tried to replicate their experiments, and they don't do it. And it's not just a marginal thing now. It's really quite common that this sort of thing is happening, and that'll destroy, or is on the way of destroying science. The other point I wanted to make is my experience is almost the opposite of Jim's. I went to a large university that started out as a land grant agricultural college, Michigan State. And so the spirit of science was there. But what they did, at least when I was there, was they created certain small residential colleges within the university that really were sort of, as I look back on it, bastions of a kind of liberal education. Now, as I keep up with what's happening in Michigan State, I joined one of those colleges. It was James Madison College. As I look at what's happened at James Madison, I don't know that it's the same thing as when I was there, well, decades ago. But that's not a bad model, and even in major universities, to have some people there leavening the lump, But I still think the best situation is what Jim was talking about, the liberal education in the small colleges that really form good men and good citizens. I love our statement of mission. I just wish our faculty would all try to understand it and dedicate themselves to it.
Roger, do you think that proposition that there's an ethical component to the educational mission, which is a controversial one in some places today?
Yeah.
Does it come down to that this has come up in all the conversation with Jim and other teachers, that the importance of making a good person, not just transferring knowledge or information from one to another? Is that really the heart of the matter?
Well, I think it is, and that's what distinguished Socrates from all the other teachers, formal teachers, or teachers, not religious figures in antiquity, is that he aimed to get people to aim their souls at being good and being just, and not at being better shoemakers or soldiers. It was ethical at its core, and it's because of that moral power that kind of teaching has, that Plato's dialogues still inspire people. They don't inspire all, but they inspire a great many. A lot of people have started their interest in philosophy reading Plato, and that's what I meant when I joked earlier about it being for young men, because it really is inspiring for a certain kind of young men who have a fire of philosophy in their souls.
I had in the spring semester, I put together a special topics seminar on forming good men and good citizens. Unfortunately, I had about 8 or 10 guys. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way, so it wasn't as good as it could have been, I think. But what we did was we read great ideas about education. We started with selections from Plato's Republic. We read Locke's thoughts on education. Then we went to the American founders, what they had to say, Franklin, Jefferson, and so on about education. We looked at the 19th century educational reformers. And then we looked at actually the the history of the catalogs of Hampden-Sydney College to try to see what Hampden-Sydney tried to accomplish. And I can say this at least for the time from antiquity through the beginning of the 20th century, about the time that the German model of higher education was adopted in the United States, there was no question about the fundamental purpose of a higher education, and that was formation of character, creating the gentleman, the well-rounded person, everything that is implied in that idea of a gentleman, moderation, care for others, and so on. That was the core of higher education.
Can you excuse me just for a few seconds? I have to go answer the door. There's somebody at the door. I'll be right back.
Sure, no problem. Take your time.
Stop the recording.
We're almost done. Hey, Roger, this is off the record, off the recording. I had a question for you. One of the things that's really fascinating me, I've spent a lot of time in China and I've taught there. And a chance, I can't pass up the chance to ask an expert this question. I get a sense sometimes that I say that the Chinese are trying to split the democratic atom, I call it, that we've always associated that it was impossible to be personally free without being politically free.
Yeah.
And they seems to me like they're trying to create a world where as long as the choices you make about yourself are free, what job you have, what car you buy, what clothes you wear, you don't have to worry about the social freedom. And I get this a lot when I go to Singapore and I ask you about the elections, and they'll say, "Oh, I don't care who wins the election." So the Singaporeans, a lot of times I get this sense of, I'm good. I get to choose what I have for dinner tonight. I get to choose what car I buy. It doesn't matter. They all feign this indifference to politics as long as they keep getting richer.
I think they were trying that until I believe they started to see the limits of that possibility. I think Xi is, how you pronounce it, is clamping down pretty hard.
It got out of control, probably. So
it's a hard row to hoe, or a narrow path to follow to allow personal freedom, but political organization. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church. So on a mission when I was a young man, I went to Spain, and it was under Franco. Okay, so by that time, Franco had exactly that same kind of situation going. You could do just about what you wanted to, as long as you didn't get involved in politics. Okay, but then when Franco died, it all just blew away. Juan Carlos was made king, but he was a democratizing monarch, and so Spain is now what it is, for better or for worse. I think that what she saw was that would be the if they didn't do something about cracking down, that would be the fate of communist rule in China. And so they're working on that, but I don't know that in the long run it does work.
I was just asking about
yeah.
China, that's all.
Don't you think that there's something in human beings that really wants an outlet in some kind of political freedom, and that's what happened in Spain, and it's in a sense it happened in ancient Rome during the period of the tyrannical emperors, which were like 400 years of Franco. And not letting, and there was no opportunity for political power, but there was growing in in Rome during that period, the Catholic Church, the church, and that had plenty of opportunities for engaging in politics. And you could rise to a bishop, or you could rise to a cardinal or a pope, and it was full of party politics and the kind of thing that goes on. So it provided an outlet for a certain kind of a person who needed that. Of course, it was contrary to the principles of Jesus, but to do that kind of politicking. But it was an outlet, and don't you suppose there'll always be riots in China, or because people yearn for political freedom? We're political animals, and it doesn't just mean that we want to live with other people. It means we want to have control over our society.
To echo what Jim is saying there, if you look at the crucial part of the Declaration of Independence, it says we hold these men are all human beings are created equal, endowed by their Creator certainly inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and governments are instituted among men by the consent of the governed to secure those rights. When I teach American political thought, I point out that the culmination of the principle of equality and natural rights is government by consent of the governed, and it's exactly for what Jim is saying, that we human beings want to be a part of as Aristotle would say, of a community that speaks about the good and the just. We want to be a part of it. It's consistent with our nature as rational, self-governing individuals. And a lot of that's, we've lost sight of that, I think, in America. But what Jim's talking about is true.
Well, thank you. I do appreciate that.
Well, I know you got it from Aristotle, but it's true.
Right. Well, I felt like the Burnham Wood going to Dunsinane carrying in this plant, but it's an unusual thing. This is one of the few times that somebody has delivered a plant. I had to open the door. They wouldn't have left it out there. It would have frozen. You know?
Well, Roger, Jim, we're out of time. We're at the 1 hour, so I didn't want to end the conversation at all, but I certainly won't end it without Roger just noting that we've been doing these conversations in honor of Jim's last year as a active leader in Hampden-Sydney. And I wondered if you could, before we part, just reflect on your friendship with him. I know it's a long and strong one, and on his impact on the college.
I was trying to think about all the times we taught together and all the different things we did. Good men, good citizens, total war, ancient and modern, the Second Punic War and World War I, heroes, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the treatment of those themes by the playwrights. I tried to count them up, and without my grade books, I couldn't come up with all of the times we taught. I don't know how many it is, but it's multiple times, and they've been really rich experiences there. I've learned a lot, and I hope I've been able to share a lot. For me personally, one of the greatest things was I always envied anybody who could read Greek, and I did do Greek at Harvard as my second language, but it wasn't good enough to really read. So I sat for 2 years, two school years in Jim's baby Greek to really brush up. And then it's my way of further sucking knowledge out of his brain. I convinced him that I talked to some people about publishing the Gorgias and then getting Jim to work with me to do it. Now, of course, it's me working with Jim. But that was a fantastic experience, and I really appreciate that. I still wish I could read Greek like he does, but I can noodle it out, and with checking up a few words and the little, I can do it. I think Jim has had a really good, very powerful pro-liberal education influence on Hampden-Sydney, and I'm concerned that when he's gone, and I'm going to be going pretty soon. I'm not that much younger than Jim, and some of my colleagues, Pontuso and Eastby, a lot of ways, I think we are the bulwark of liberal education. You certainly don't find it in the philosophy department, for crying out loud, or in the other ones. So I'm really concerned about the direction that's going to go. So, but anyway, Jim is one of the pillars of the college.
Thank you, Roger. Any final words before we sign off?
Well, I would think some people would think I'm not the pillar, but I'm a pill. Anyway, I thank you, Roger, for those kind sentiments. And I hope that the college will survive and flourish. And I do think that that kind of civic virtue is a renewable fuel. So
Let's hope so. And on that optimistic note, that it is a renewable resource for the country and the world. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Roger. Appreciate your time.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So long, everybody.
We'll see you.